Helen Burns. If you've read Jane Eyre, you remember her, the saintly girl who dies of consumption in the heroine's arms. What Charlotte Bronte never told her readers was that Helen Burns was real. She was Charlotte's own sister. And she was only the first. By the time tuberculosis finished with the Brontë family, it would take 5 of the 6 children, while their father watched helpless for 40 years. Welcome to the sanatorium. I'm your host, and this is where we explore the stories of tuberculosis, the white plague that shaped our history, our culture, and our very understanding of what it means to be human. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We release new episodes regularly, and there are many more stories to tell. Tonight's episode is a long one, over 2 hours. So settle in. Find a comfortable position. Pour yourself some tea, perhaps. We're going to spend the evening with one of the most extraordinary families in literary history. And with the disease that consumed them, one by one, until only silence remained. The house stands at the top of the village. A Georgian parsonage, grey stone, modest but solid. Behind it the moors stretch endlessly, purple with heather in summer, brown and wind-scoured in winter. In the rooms downstairs the air is cold, even with the fire going. It's always cold. The year is 1848. September turning to October. In the dining room 3 women sit with their father. They are not old, these women. The eldest is 32, the youngest 28. But they have the watchful, weary eyes of people who have seen too much death. Upstairs, a man is dying. Their brother, 31 years old, and dying in the room where he was born. The cough. They all know the sound by now. The terrible wet cough that brings up blood. The fever that comes and goes. The wasting. They've been here before. 2 sisters died of this when they were children. Died young and far from home. Their mother died of something else, but she died in this house too. The parsonage has always been a place of death. But it has also been a place of fierce burning life. Of imagination. Of genius. These 3 women who sit together in the cold room have just, in the past year, published 3 of the most remarkable novels in the English language. Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Agnes Grey. The literary world is still reeling from them. And now this. The brother dying upstairs, and after him. They don't speak of it, but they know. They've always known. Tuberculosis doesn't stop with one. This is the story of the Brontë family. 6 children, 5 deaths. Of extraordinary talent that bloomed in the shadow of disease. And of a father who would bury every single one of his children before he died himself, at the age of 84. To understand the Brontes, you have to understand Haworth. This small village in the West Riding of Yorkshire perched on the edge of the moors. In the early 19th century it was an industrial town. Textile mills, poverty, overcrowding. The churchyard was so full of bodies that the ground level had risen above the church floor. Water from the graveyard seeped into the drinking supply. The average life expectancy was 25 years. This statistic deserves emphasis. 25 years. In Victorian Haworth, if you reached adulthood, you were already beating the odds. The main killer was not tuberculosis, though tuberculosis took its share. It was the water. The contaminated, corpse-tainted water that seeped down from the graveyard into the wells. Typhoid fever. Cholera. Dysentery. The dead poisoned the living. Patrick Brontë would later campaign for better sanitation in Haworth. He understood, long before the germ theory of disease was established, that something in the water was killing his parishioners. But his efforts would come too late to save his own family. Into this place in 1820 came Patrick Brontë, an Irish clergyman, ambitious, educated, a published poet. He brought with him his wife, Maria, and their 6 children, all under the age of 7. Maria, the eldest, baptised in April 1814. Elizabeth, born 8th February 1815. Charlotte, born 24th April 1816. Branwell, born 26th June 1817. Emily, born 30th July 1818. And Anne, the baby, born 17th January 1820. Patrick Brontë was a complex man. Stern, often distant, deeply concerned with propriety. He had pulled himself up from rural Irish poverty through education and the church. He believed in learning, in discipline, in the power of literature. He also believed in fresh air and long walks on the moors, which he considered healthful. In this, at least, he was ahead of his time. His wife, Maria Branwell Brontë, was Cornish. Genteel, educated, fond of reading. She had married Patrick in 1812 and followed him north to this cold, unfamiliar country. By all accounts, she never quite adjusted to Yorkshire, to the damp, to the grey skies, to the wind that never stopped. Maria wrote letters home to Cornwall describing her new life. They were cheerful letters mostly. She loved her husband. She loved her growing brood of children. But there was a wistfulness beneath the words. A longing for the warmer country she had left behind. She would never see Cornwall again. The parsonage they moved into was substantial by village standards. 2 stories, several rooms, a garden. But it was cold and damp, built on a hillside where water gathered. The church and graveyard were just beyond the wall. The children's bedroom windows looked out over the tombstones. They grew up counting graves the way other children count sheep. For 1 year, the family was intact. 6 children, 2 parents, all together in the house at the top of the village. And then tuberculosis came. Or perhaps it didn't come. Perhaps it was already there. One of the cruelties of tuberculosis is its long latency. You can carry the bacteria for years without knowing, without symptoms. And then, triggered by stress, malnutrition, another illness, it activates. It blooms in your lungs like a terrible flower. By the standards of the time, what happened to the Brontes was not unusual. Families were decimated by tuberculosis. It was the single greatest killer of the 19th century, responsible for 1 in 4 deaths. But even by those standards, the Brontë toll was extraordinary. 5 of 6 children, all before the age of 40. All, almost certainly, from the same disease. Time just threes. This is not just a story about death, though. It's a story about what people create in the face of death. How genius and disease can exist in the same body, The same family, feeding on each other in ways we still don't fully understand. The Brontes wrote with an intensity that seemed to consume them. And perhaps it did. But what they left behind has outlasted the disease by nearly 2 centuries. There is a temptation when telling this story to make it romantic. To suggest that somehow tuberculosis was connected to genius. That the disease sharpened their minds, purified their art. The Victorians believed something like this. They called tuberculosis the romantic disease. They saw something beautiful in the pale skin, the bright eyes, the ethereal thinness of the consumptive. This is nonsense, of course. And dangerous nonsense at that. Tuberculosis was not romantic. It was slow suffocation, drowning in your own blood, fever and sweating and wasting away until there was nothing left. The Brontes did not write great novels because of tuberculosis. They wrote great novels despite it. The disease was not their muse. It was their executioner. Let's begin. Maria Brontë, the mother, began to feel unwell in January 1821. She was 38 years old. She had borne 6 children in 8 years. She was tired, she said. So tired. The tiredness deepened. She took to her bed. The doctor was called. An expense the family could barely afford, but Patrick was frightened. His wife was slipping away from him, and he didn't understand why. The diagnosis, when it came, was internal cancer. There was nothing to be done. No surgery, no cure, no hope. Maria lingered through the spring and summer, in increasing pain, taking laudanum when it became unbearable. The children were kept away. They heard their mother crying at night. She died in September 1821. Maria was 7. Elizabeth was 6. Charlotte was 5. Branwell 4. Emily 3. Anne was just 20 months old. Patrick Brontë was devastated. By all accounts, he had loved his wife deeply. He shut himself in his room for days after the funeral. He wept. He prayed. And when he emerged, he was changed. More rigid. More distant. He ate his meals alone in his study. He saw his children in the mornings and evenings, but otherwise left their care to servants. His sister-in-law, Elizabeth Branwell, came from Cornwall to help with the children. She was a spinster, 50 years old, set in her ways. She took charge of the household with efficiency but little warmth. The children called her Aunt Branwell. They did not love her. So the 6 Brontë children grew up essentially alone. They had each other, and they had the moors, and they had books. Patrick, for all his distance, believed passionately in education. His children would read. They would learn. They would better themselves. He brought them newspapers, magazines, books from his own library. He discussed politics and current events with them over breakfast. He treated them, in this way, almost as adults. The 2 eldest girls, Maria and Elizabeth, were particularly precocious. Maria at 7 could read the newspapers and debate their contents. She was thoughtful, serious, deeply religious. Elizabeth was quieter but equally intelligent. Charlotte later remembered them both with a kind of awe. They seemed so much older than their years. So wise. Maria especially seemed marked for something great. She had a quality that Charlotte could only describe as saintliness. A patience beyond her years. A kindness that extended to everyone, even the servants who sometimes treated her roughly. Charlotte watched her elder sister and wondered what she would become. A teacher, perhaps. A writer. Something remarkable. But Maria would not grow up to be anything. Maria would die at 11, and all that potential would be snuffed out like a candle. Charlotte would spend the rest of her life imagining what Maria might have been. What she might have done. How different everything might have been if Maria had lived. In 1824, Patrick Brontë made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He enrolled Maria and Elizabeth in the clergy daughters' school at Cowan Bridge, about 40 miles from Hulworth. It was a charity school designed to educate the daughters of poor clergymen. The fees were low. The curriculum was serious. It seemed like an opportunity. In July 1824, Maria and Elizabeth were sent away. Maria was 10. Elizabeth was 9. In August, Charlotte joined them. She was 8 years old. In November, Emily arrived as well. She had just turned 6. 4 little girls, the eldest barely 10, sent away from home to a school run by strangers. Cowan Bridge was a nightmare. We know this not just from Charlotte's later fictionalisation of it in Jane Eyre, but from historical records and the testimony of other pupils. The school was underfunded, poorly heated, unsanitary. The food was often spoiled or badly cooked. Meals of burned porridge, rancid butter, meat gone off. The girls ate it because they were hungry and then they got sick. The building itself seemed designed to break the spirit. Long, cold corridors, bare stone walls, windows that let in more cold than light. The chapel was unheated, and the girls were required to sit through long services every Sunday, their breath visible in the frigid air. They developed coughs, fevers, chilblains that cracked and bled. The school infirmary was always full. The curriculum was rigorous but inconsistent. The girls studied arithmetic, grammar, history, geography. They sewed. They read the Bible. They were drilled in proper behaviour and deportment. But the teaching was often perfunctory, the books inadequate. The real purpose of the school, it seemed, was not education but reformation. These were the daughters of poor clergymen. They must learn humility. They must learn to endure. The dormitories were unheated. In winter, water in the wash basins froze overnight. The girls slept 2 to a bed for warmth, but it was never enough. They woke shivering, dressed in the dark, walked to the schoolroom with chilblains on their feet. Some mornings, ice had formed on the inside of the windows. The girls scraped patterns in it with their fingernails, trying to find something beautiful in their misery. The regime was harsh. The headmaster, Reverend Carus Wilson, believed that comfort was sinful. That suffering purified the soul. That these charity girls should be grateful for any education at all and not complain about cold or hunger. Punishments were frequent and public. Girls were made to stand on stools for hours. to wear signs around their necks proclaiming their faults, to go without food as penance. Maria Bronte, the eldest sister, bore the brunt of it. She was untidy, the teacher said. Her sewing was poor. She daydreamed. She was punished again and again for small infractions. Charlotte, 8 years old, watched her sister being humiliated and could do nothing. She never forgot it. And then, in the spring of 1825, Maria became ill. She had a cough, a fever. She was weak, so weak she could barely stand. But the school had a policy. If a girl was well enough to be out of bed, she was well enough for lessons. Maria was sent to class. She fainted at her desk. Finally, in February 1825, the school sent her home. She was in the advanced stages of tuberculosis. Her lungs were destroyed. There was nothing anyone could do. Maria died at home on 6 May 1825. He was 11 years old. Patrick brought Elizabeth home 2 weeks later, hoping the fresh air of Haworth might revive her. But she had the same cough, the same fever. The disease was already too advanced. Elizabeth died on 15th June 1825. She was 10 years old. Charlotte and Emily were pulled from the school immediately. They came home to a house of mourning. 4 children left of the original 6. Charlotte, 9 years old. Branwell, 7. Emily, 6. Anne, 5. 2 more small coffins went into the family vault beneath the church floor. Patrick stood over the graves of his wife and 2 eldest daughters. He was 48 years old. He had been in Haworth for 5 years. Half his family was already dead. The children who survived would carry those deaths with them always. Charlotte, especially. She had watched Maria suffer the cruelty of Cowan Bridge. Watched her waste away. Watched her die. 22 years later, when she wrote Jane Eyre, she put Maria in the book. Helen Burns, the saintly, patient girl who endures every punishment without complaint, who dies of consumption in the heroine's arms. Helen Burns is one of the most famous characters in Victorian literature. Millions of readers have wept over her death. But she was real. She was Charlotte's sister, and Charlotte couldn't save her. In the novel, Helen speaks of heaven with perfect faith. She tells Jane that death is not an end but a beginning, that they will meet again in a better world. Charlotte put these words in Helen's mouth, but they were Maria's words. Maria, at 11 years old, dying of tuberculosis, had comforted her younger sister with promises of paradise. She had faced death with a calm that Charlotte never forgot, that she could never quite believe. Charlotte was 9 when Maria died, old enough to understand, old enough to remember. For the rest of her life, she carried the memory of her eldest sister, the one who should have led them, the one who was taken first. When Charlotte became famous, when Jane Eyre was celebrated around the world, she must have thought of Maria, of what Maria might have become if she had lived, of the books Maria might have written. After Maria and Elizabeth died, Patrick Brontë made another decision. No more boarding schools. His children would stay home. He would educate them himself with help from Aunt Branwell and occasional tutors. the 4 remaining children would not be separated again. And so began one of the most extraordinary childhoods in literary history. The 4 Brontë children, Charlotte, Branwell, Emily and Anne, spent their days in almost complete isolation. They had no real friends outside the family. No school, no social calls, no parties. The village children were rough, Patrick said. Not suitable companions for his educated offspring. Aunt Branwell was strict about propriety. Young ladies did not wander the streets. They stayed home. So the children had each other, and they had the moors. Every afternoon they went walking, miles and miles across the open moorland. In sun and rain, and wind so strong it nearly knocked them over. They knew every hill, every stream, every outcropping of rock. The moor was their playground, their sanctuary, their whole world. And they had their imaginations. In June 1826, Patrick brought home a box of wooden soldiers for Branwell. The 4 children seized on them immediately. Each child claimed a soldier and gave it a name. Charlotte's was the Duke of Wellington. Emily's was a character called Gravy. And then they began to tell stories. This was the moment scholars believe when the Brontë creative universe was born. A box of toy soldiers and 4 lonely children with no one to play with but each other. From such small beginnings came worlds. Entire continents of imagination. It is hard to overstate how important this moment was. These children, grieving, isolated, half-orphaned, turned inward. And what they found there would eventually change literature. At first the stories were simple games, adventures for the wooden soldiers, but they grew, they deepened, they became entire worlds. The children invented a place called Glasstown, an imaginary African colony. They drew maps. They wrote constitutions, newspapers, histories. They created characters with complex lives and relationships. And they wrote it all down. The manuscripts they produced are extraordinary. Tiny books, some no bigger than a matchbox, written in microscopic handwriting. The children stitched them together from scraps of paper and sugar sacks. The writing is so small you need a magnifying glass to read it. They made them small, scholars think, to mimic real printed books, or perhaps to hide them from adults. These were private worlds. Secret worlds. Today, these miniature manuscripts are among the most precious items in the Brontë Parsonage Museum. Scholars have spent years deciphering them. They contain entire novellas, poems, plays, maps of imaginary countries, family trees of fictional dynasties. The children created not just stories but entire civilizations, languages, religions, wars and treaties and romances spanning generations. The miniature scale was part of the magic, time twos. By making the books tiny, the children made them secret. They could slip them into pockets, hide them in drawers, carry their imaginary worlds with them wherever they went. These were not stories to be shared with adults. They were private conversations between siblings. A language only they could speak. Glasstown evolved over the years. Charlotte and Branwell developed it into an elaborate saga called Angria, full of passion, war, intrigue. The Duke of Zamorna became their central character. Dark, brooding, irresistible. He would reappear, transformed in Charlotte's later novels as Rochester. The siblings wrote endless stories of war, betrayal, and forbidden love. Angria was their apprenticeship. Every trope Charlotte later perfected, the mysterious man with a secret past, the passionate but doomed romance, the woman who loves unwisely, first appeared in the tiny pages of the Angrian Chronicles. Emily and Anne, meanwhile, created their own world. Gondal. A bleak northern island with feuding royal families. Where Angria was tropical and passionate, Gondal was cold and fierce. Its landscape was the landscape of Yorkshire, moors and mountains, wild weather, harsh beauty. Its characters were proud and violent, driven by honour and vengeance. Emily would write Gondal poetry for the rest of her short life. The intensity of Wuthering Heights, its wild passion, its cosmic scale, was born in the frozen wastes of Gondal. The split between the pairs is telling. Charlotte and Branwell, the two eldest survivors, wrote together. Emily and Anne, the two youngest, wrote together. The partnerships would last their whole lives. Even as adults, Emily and Anne continued the Gondal stories. They would be walking the moors and suddenly start talking about what Augusta Almeida was doing, or whether Julius Brenzida would survive the war. The imaginary world was as real to them as Holworth. This was their education in writing. Not formal instruction, but obsessive-compulsive practice. By the time Charlotte was 15, she had written more words than most people write in a lifetime. The same was true for the others. They lived half in the real world, half in worlds of their own creation. The line between the two was never quite clear. It was, in some ways, an idyllic childhood. Freedom, imagination, the wild beauty of the moors. But it was also profoundly strange. 4 children growing up in near-total isolation, living more in fantasy than reality. No mother. A distant father. An aunt who cared for them but didn't love them. And always, the memory of the 2 dead sisters. The knowledge that death had already visited their family and might come again. Branwell was the only son, the golden boy. Patrick had great hopes for him. Branwell would be a scholar, a painter, a poet. He would make the family name famous. The sisters were clever, yes, but they were only girls. Their futures were limited. But Branwell had no limits. This was the tragedy of Victorian expectations. The son, given every advantage, every encouragement, every opportunity, would destroy himself with drink and opium. The daughters, told their best hope was to marry or teach, would become some of the greatest novelists in the English language. Patrick invested everything in the wrong child. He could not see the genius under his own roof because it came in the wrong bodies. Female bodies. Bodies that were supposed to be vessels for children, not ideas. The boy himself seemed to believe it. He was brilliant, charming, full of energy. He talked about his future greatness constantly. He would be a painter, like Sir Joshua Reynolds. a poet like Byron, a writer whose name would echo through the ages. His sisters adored him, especially Charlotte, who was closest to him in age. They collaborated on the Angrian stories. They wrote poetry together. They walked the moors and talked about art and ambition. Charlotte believed in her brother. They all did. Emily was different from the others. Even as a child, she was solitary, fierce, independent. She loved the moors more than anyone. She would walk for hours alone, coming home windblown and silent. She was tall for a girl of her time, strong, athletic, uninterested in feminine accomplishments. She hated sewing, hated socialising, hated anything that confined her. There was something untouchable about Emily. A wildness that none of the others possessed. She seemed to belong not to the human world, but to the moors themselves. When she was away from Haworth, at school, at work, she literally could not survive. She would sicken, stop eating, pine away. Only on the moors was she fully alive. Only there was she herself. We have so few of Emily's own words outside her novel and poems. No letters survive. The diary fragments are brief and enigmatic. She remains a mystery. A presence felt, but never fully understood. Perhaps she preferred it that way. Perhaps her privacy was the one thing she would never surrender. Anne was the baby. Sweet-natured, gentle, often overlooked. She was Emily's special companion. The two of them created Gondal together and continued writing about it into their 20s. Where Emily was fierce, Anne was quiet. Where Emily was wild, Anne was careful. But they understood each other perfectly. Anne suffered from a respiratory condition even as a child, possibly asthma, possibly early signs of the tuberculosis that would kill her. She was delicate where Emily was robust. She required care and gentleness. Emily provided both, with tenderness she showed no one else. When Anne was ill, Emily sat with her. When Anne was sad, Emily walked with her on the moors. They were inseparable. Charlotte was the leader. Small, barely 5 feet tall, but fierce and ambitious. She read voraciously. Novels, poetry, history, anything she could get her hands on. She drew and painted with meticulous care. She wrote endlessly, filling notebook after notebook with tiny cramped handwriting. She was plain, she knew, small and plain and poor. But she had her mind, her imagination, her will. Charlotte's eyes were weak. She was severely nearsighted. To write, she had to hold the paper inches from her face. Perhaps this is why her handwriting was so small. Perhaps this is why she saw the world so intensely. What she could not see clearly, she imagined vividly. Her inner world was more vivid than the blurred reality outside it. She was also painfully aware of her limitations. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by beauty and marriageability, Charlotte knew she had neither. She channeled that awareness into her writing. Jane Eyre is a manifesto for plain women everywhere. A declaration that beauty is not the measure of a soul. That to be small and plain and poor is not to be worthless. The children grew older. Charlotte attended a school called Roe Head for a brief period in the 1830s, a better experience than Cowan Bridge, but still marked by homesickness. Emily tried school as well, but lasted only 3 months before the homesickness became unbearable. She physically pined for Haworth. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Charlotte brought her home before she died of it. Anne managed school better than her sisters, but she too preferred home. All of them did. The parsonage, for all its coldness and grief, was where they belonged. It was the only place they could breathe. But they could not stay children forever. By the late 1830s, they were young adults. Charlotte was in her 20s. They needed to earn their livings. And for poor, unmarried women of the middle class, there were exactly 2 options: governess or teacher. All 3 sisters tried both. And all 3 hated it. Being a governess meant living in someone else's house, caring for someone else's children. You were neither servant nor family member. You ate alone. You had no privacy, no freedom, no respect. The children were often spoiled and resentful. The parents treated you as a necessary inconvenience. The pay was terrible. Charlotte took a position with a family called the Sidgwicks in 1839. She lasted less than 3 months. The children were undisciplined, the mother critical, the work exhausting. Charlotte was miserable. She wrote desperate letters home. She felt like a slave, she said. Worse than a slave. Anne fared somewhat better. She spent 5 years as a governess with 2 different families. She was conscientious, patient, determined to do well. But she was lonely and often ill. And she saw, up close, the casual cruelty of the wealthy toward those in their power. She would write about it later in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, one of the first novels to deal honestly with alcoholism and domestic abuse. Emily tried being a teacher at a school near Halifax. She lasted 6 months. She was desperately homesick, barely able to function. She came home thin and silent and haunted. After that, no one tried to send her away again. Emily would stay at Haworth. She would keep house for her father and aunt. She would walk the moors. She would write her poetry and her gondel stories. That was enough. In 1842, Charlotte had an idea. What if she and Emily could study abroad? Learn French, German, music. They could open their own school when they returned. Be their own employers. Have some independence. Aunt Branwell agreed to fund it. The girls would go to Brussels. In February 1842, Charlotte and Emily enrolled at the Pensionnat Eyre, a girls' school in Brussels run by Monsieur and Madame Eyre. It was Charlotte's first time leaving England. Emily's too. They were terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The school was everything Cowan Bridge had not been. Warm, intellectually stimulating, cosmopolitan. Monsieur Eyre was a gifted teacher. He recognised Charlotte's talent immediately and pushed her to develop it. He gave her books, discussed literature with her, critiqued her writing. Charlotte, starved for intellectual companionship, bloomed under his attention. She also fell in love with him. Constantine Heger was married, with children. He was not particularly handsome. But he was brilliant, passionate about ideas, and he took Charlotte seriously as an intellect. For Charlotte, 26 years old, plain, poor, convinced she would never marry, this was intoxicating. Nothing happened, of course. Eyre was an honourable man. He was kind to Charlotte, but nothing more. Still, Charlotte's feelings deepened. She tried to hide them. She mostly succeeded. But the longing was there, burning beneath her quiet exterior. In November 1842, Aunt Branwell died suddenly. Charlotte and Emily returned to Haworth for the funeral. Emily stayed home after that. She had no desire to return to Brussels. But Charlotte went back. She told herself it was to finish her studies. Time? One's? Really, it was to be near Eyre. The second year in Brussels was miserable. Madame Eyre, who had perhaps guessed Charlotte's feelings, grew cold. She kept Charlotte busy with menial tasks, kept her away from her husband. Charlotte was lonely, isolated, desperately unhappy. She stayed until January 1844, and then she came home for good. After she left, Charlotte wrote Eyre letters. Passionate, desperate letters. She tried to make them sound casual, but the longing bled through every line. Eyre did not respond. Or if he did, his responses were brief and discouraging. Eventually, Charlotte stopped writing. She had been rejected, and she knew it. She channeled the pain into her writing. Years later, in Villette, she would put Eyre in her novel as Paul Emmanuel, the difficult, brilliant teacher whom the heroine loves hopelessly. It's one of the most psychologically acute portraits of unrequited love in literature. And it's drawn directly from Charlotte's own heart. By 1845, all three sisters were back at Haworth. The school plan had failed. They had advertised for pupils but received no responses. No one wanted to send their daughters to a remote parsonage in Yorkshire run by unknown governesses. The dream was over before it began. Charlotte was 29. Emily was 27. Anne was 25. Unmarried, unemployed, living with their aging father and their increasingly dissolute brother. Branwell's grand dreams had all come to nothing. He had failed as a painter, as a tutor, as everything he tried. He was drinking heavily. The golden boy was tarnished. The sisters might have lived and died in obscurity. Might have become nothing more than footnotes in the history of their famous parsonage. Three spinsters caring for an aging father in a remote village. It was the fate of thousands of Victorian women. Quiet lives. Invisible lives. Lives that left no mark on the world. But these particular spinsters had spent their childhoods creating worlds. They had written millions of words before they turned 20. They had taught themselves narrative technique through endless practice. They had developed voices that were uniquely their own. The years of isolation had not been wasted. They had been training. Except for one thing. They could write. And they were about to prove it. In the autumn of 1845, Charlotte made a discovery. She found a notebook of Emily's poems. She read them. And she was stunned. Emily's poetry was unlike anything Charlotte had read. Dark, mystical, intensely powerful. Poems about freedom and death, about the moors and the soul, about a fierce inner life that had nothing to do with the quiet, austere woman who kept house for their father. These were the poems of a genius. One poem in particular stopped Charlotte cold. "No coward soul is mine," it began. Emily wrote of a faith beyond conventional religion, of a God that animated all living things, of her own soul, undaunted by death or doubt. The poem was defiant, almost arrogant in its certainty. This was not the voice of a timid Yorkshire spinster. This was the voice of a prophet. Another poem described a prisoner in a dungeon, visited by a wild vision of freedom. The imagery was ecstatic, almost hallucinatory. Scholars still debate whether Emily experienced genuine mystical states. What is certain is that she had access to something most people never touch. Some deep well of consciousness, some doorway to the infinite. Charlotte showed them to Anne. Anne quietly revealed that she too had been writing poetry. Charlotte looked at her own work, years of poems tucked away in drawers, and suddenly she saw a possibility. Yes, they could publish. Together. A joint volume of poetry by three sisters. Emily was furious when Charlotte suggested it. Her poems were private, not meant for the world. She felt violated by Charlotte's discovery of them. But Charlotte was persuasive. Charlotte was always persuasive. And eventually Emily agreed. On one condition: they would publish under pseudonyms. Male pseudonyms. And so Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell were born. Currer for Charlotte, Ellis for Emily, Acton for Anne. Androgynous names. Names that could be male or female. The sisters used their own money, the small inheritance from Aunt Branwell, to pay for publication. The book came out in May 1846. It sold 2 copies. 2. In the entire first year of publication, exactly 2 people bought the poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. The reviews were few and lukewarm. The book disappeared without a trace. But the sisters were not discouraged. By the time the poems were published, they were already working on something else. Novels. All 3 of them, simultaneously, were writing novels. Charlotte was working on The Professor, based on her experiences in Brussels. Emily was writing Wuthering Heights, a dark tale of passion and revenge on the Yorkshire moors. Anne was writing Agnes Grey, a quiet, realistic portrait of a governess's life. They wrote at the dining room table, all together in the same room, late into the night. Walking in circles around the table, discussing plot points and character development. They critiqued each other's work. They read passages aloud. They encouraged each other when the work was hard. And upstairs they could hear Branwell, drunk, raving, sometimes weeping. Branwell Bronte's decline had been gradual and sudden. He had taken a position as a tutor with a wealthy family called the Robinsons. And there, he said, he'd fallen in love with his employer's wife. Mrs. Robinson, he claimed, loved him in return. They had an affair. They planned to marry after her husband died. How much of this was true is still debated. Branwell was discovered in some kind of inappropriate relationship with Mrs. Robinson and dismissed from his position in disgrace. That much is fact. Whether it was truly an affair, or whether Branwell had made unwanted advances, or whether he simply fantasized the whole thing, we will never know. What is certain is that Branwell believed it was real. And when Mr. Robinson died, and Mrs. Robinson married someone else, someone rich and age-appropriate, Branwell was shattered. He came home to Holworth in the summer of 845 and never left again. He drank. He took laudanum. He ran up debts at every public house in the village. He raved about his lost love. He threatened suicide. He had fits of delirium, tremens. Patrick was heartbroken. His son, his brilliant son, had fallen so far. The sisters were angry, frustrated, exhausted. They loved Branwell, but he was destroying himself and making their lives miserable in the process. Charlotte wrote bitterly in her letters about her brother. She could not forgive him for wasting his gifts, for choosing drink and self-pity over work. The sisters were writing great novels in the dining room while Branwell sobbed in his bedroom. The contrast was stark, but there was love too beneath the anger. Charlotte had adored Branwell once. They had been creative partners, co-creators of Angria. She remembered the boy he had been, brilliant, funny, full of promise. To see him destroy himself was a special kind of torture. It was like watching her own childhood die. Emily said little about Branwell's condition, but she cared for him dutifully. She brought him food he would not eat. She cleaned up after his episodes. She listened to his ravings with patience she showed no one else. Perhaps she understood something the others did not. Perhaps she saw in Branwell's despair a mirror of her own fierce inner life. They were both extreme people in different ways. And yet, they must have known on some level what was coming. Branwell was not just drunk. He was sick. He had a cough. A persistent worsening cough. He was losing weight. He had night sweats. Tuberculosis. Family disease. It was back. But before the disease claimed anyone else, the sisters had a triumph. In the spring and summer of 1847, they sent their novels out to publishers. The Professor was rejected repeatedly. Charlotte was disappointed but philosophical. She started work on a second novel. But Emily's Wuthering Heights and Anne's Agnes Grey were accepted by a small publisher named Thomas Courtly Newby. They would be published together as a 3-volume set. The books came out in December 1847. By that time, Charlotte's second novel was also out. She had written it in less than a year. A story of an orphan girl, plain and poor but fierce and passionate. A girl who becomes a governess and falls in love with her employer, the dark and difficult Mr. Rochester. The novel was called Jane Eyre. It was published on 19th October 1847. And it was an immediate sensation. The critics raved. Readers devoured it. Who was this Currabell? Where had he come from? The novel was passionate, unconventional, psychologically complex in a way Victorian novels rarely were. The heroine was no passive beauty. She was small and plain and angry. She demanded equality, respect, love on her own terms. It was revolutionary. Do you think Because I'm poor, obscure, plain and little. I am soulless and heartless. Jane cries to Rochester. You think wrong. I have as much soul as you and full as much heart. Readers had never encountered anything like it. Here was a woman who refused to be diminished, who demanded to be seen as an equal, who spoke truths that Victorian society preferred to keep silent. The novel touched something deep in its readers. Women especially. Women who had been told all their lives to be quiet, to be grateful, to accept their place. Here was Jane Eyre saying no. Saying I deserve more. Saying I will not be a possession or a convenience or a decoration. The book was a revelation. Jane Eyre became one of the best-selling novels of the decade. Charlotte Brontë at 31 was famous. Except no one knew Charlotte Brontë had written it. They thought Currer Bell was a man. Or possibly a woman. Or possibly multiple people. The speculation was intense. Emily's Wuthering Heights, published 2 months later, received a more mixed reception. Some critics were appalled. The book was violent, dark, morally ambiguous. The characters were cruel and obsessive. Heathcliff was barely human. Catherine was wild and selfish. The whole thing was too strange, too fierce, too much. But others recognised its power. This was not like other novels. This was something new, something almost mythic. The Moors themselves seemed to be a character, wild and indifferent to human suffering. The love story was not gentle or redemptive. It was destructive, all-consuming, eternal. Wuthering Heights would later be recognised as one of the greatest novels in the English language. But in 1847, most people didn't know what to make of it. It was too far ahead of its time. What critics missed was the novel's cosmic scope. This was not a love story in any conventional sense. Catherine and Heathcliff were not lovers who met and courted and married. They were something more primordial. Two halves of the same soul, split apart by class and circumstance. I am Heathcliff, Catherine cries. Not I love Heathcliff. I am Heathcliff. Their love was not romance. It was identity. Essence. Something beyond the material world. Emily took everything she had learned in Gondal, the fierce landscapes, the doomed dynasties, the passion that destroys everything it touches, and distilled it into one novel. She would never write another. She didn't need to. Everything she had to say was in those pages. And Agnes Grey was largely overlooked. It was published in the same volume as Wuthering Heights, but it was quieter, less dramatic. A realistic story of a governess's struggles. No passion, no violence, just careful observation of the small cruelties of everyday life. But Anne was already at work on her second novel. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. A book about a woman who leaves her alcoholic, abusive husband to protect her son. It was based in part on Anne's observations of Branwell. It was unflinching in its portrayal of addiction and domestic violence. And it argued that women had the right to leave bad marriages. In 1848, this was radical. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was published in June 1848. It sold well, though critics were shocked by its subject matter. Anne Brontë, the quietest and sweetest of the sisters, had written something genuinely subversive. In the preface to the second edition, Anne defended her choice of subject matter. "When we have to do with vice and vicious characters," she wrote, "I maintain it is better to depict them as they really are than as they would wish to appear." She was tired, she said, of novels that made villainy look attractive. That prettified sin. She wanted to show the truth. And the truth about alcoholism, about abusive marriage, was not pretty. Charlotte never fully appreciated the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. After Anne's death, Charlotte prevented the novel from being republished. She thought it was a mistake, she said, that Anne had chosen an unsuitable subject. It took more than a century for Anne's reputation to recover from Charlotte's judgment. Today, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is recognised as one of the first feminist novels. Anne was ahead of her time. Perhaps too far ahead for even her own sister to see. So, by the summer of 1848, all three sisters were published novelists. Charlotte was famous. Emily and Anne were known, if less celebrated. They had done it. They had broken through. Three poor, obscure women from a remote Yorkshire village had made their mark on literature. And upstairs, Branwell was dying. By September 1848, he was bedridden. The cough was constant now. Blood in the handkerchiefs. Fever that came and went. Delirium. He was 31 years old and wasting to nothing. His father sat with him. Patrick Brontë, who had once had such hopes for his only son. The sisters came in and out, bringing water, changing the bedclothes. What did they feel? Grief, certainly. Pity. Anger, maybe, at the waste of it all. Relief that the chaos would soon be over. All of these things at once. Branwell died on 24th September 1848. His father was with him at the end. Patrick had now buried his wife and three children. He was 71 years old. The funeral was held at the church, just beyond the parsonage wall. The three sisters attended. Charlotte, Emily, Anne. They stood in the cold church and listened to their father perform the service. Another Brontë in the family vault. It was raining. The wind was fierce. Emily stood through the whole service without a shawl. She caught cold walking home. The cold turned into a cough. The cough worsened. Emily Brontë was 30 years old in the autumn of 1848. Tall, strong, capable. She had never been seriously ill in her life. She walked the moors in all weather. She was healthy. She would be fine. But the cough did not go away. And by October it was getting worse. Charlotte watched her sister with growing alarm. She knew that cough. She had heard it from Maria, from Elizabeth, from Branwell just weeks ago. She knew what it meant. Emily refused to admit anything was wrong. She got up every morning at 7. She fed the dogs. She kneaded the bread. She went about her household tasks with grim determination. When Charlotte suggested she rest, Emily snapped at her. When Charlotte suggested calling the doctor, Emily refused outright. Emily Brontë did not believe in doctors. She called medicine quackery. She had seen what doctors did. The bleeding, the purging, the useless remedies that only made people suffer more. She would not submit to that. She would not be prodded and examined and dosed with poisons. If she was going to die, she would die on her own terms. In this, Emily was not entirely wrong. Victorian medicine had almost nothing to offer tuberculosis patients. The common treatments, bloodletting, mercury compounds, opium, did more harm than good. Some doctors prescribed sea air or mountain air. Others recommended complete bed rest. Still others insisted on vigorous exercise. No one knew what caused the disease. No one knew how to cure it. The bacteria that caused tuberculosis would not be discovered until 1882, 34 years after Emily's death. So Emily's refusal of medical help was not simply stubbornness. It was a kind of clear-eyed realism. The doctors could not save her. Nothing could save her. She would spend her remaining time on her own terms, doing the things she loved. Walking the moors, feeding her dogs, living as she had always lived. Until she couldn't anymore. But she was not ready to die yet. So she simply pretended she was not ill. She forced herself through each day. She would not stay in bed. She would not complain. She would not acknowledge weakness. Charlotte and Anne watched helplessly. They could see Emily fading. Time? Wands. Losing weight. Growing pale. The cough was constant now, racking her whole frame. She could barely catch her breath. But still she refused all help. In November, Charlotte wrote to her publisher. She could not write, she said. She could not think about novels or revisions or anything except her sister. Emily was very ill and would not see a doctor. Charlotte was terrified. Anne was terrified too. But Anne was also beginning to feel unwell herself. She had a cough. Not as bad as Emily's yet. But it was there. She said nothing. What good would it do? Emily was dying in front of them. Charlotte was barely holding herself together. Anne would not add to their burdens. December came. Cold, dark December. Emily was still forcing herself to rise, to work. But she was so weak now that she could barely stand. She leaned on furniture to cross a room. She paused for breath every few steps. Her eyes were huge in her wasted face. Charlotte begged her to rest, to see a doctor, to take something for the pain. Emily refused. She was angry now, defensive. She snapped at her sisters when they tried to help. "Leave me alone," she said. "I'm fine." She was not fine. On the morning of 19th December 1848, Emily came downstairs as usual. She fed the dogs. She tried to pick up her sewing. And then she collapsed. Charlotte and Anne carried her to the sofa. For the first time, Emily did not fight them. She was too weak to fight. She lay on the sofa, struggling to breathe, and finally, she whispered that they could send for the doctor. It was too late. The doctor came that afternoon. He examined Emily and shook his head. There was nothing to be done. Her lungs were gone. She was drowning in her own body. It was a matter of hours now, not days. Emily died at 2 o'clock that afternoon. She was 30 years old. She had been ill for less than 3 months. Charlotte was with her at the end. So was Anne, Time, Hans, and their father. Emily died on the sofa in the dining room, the room where she had written Wuthering Heights. The dogs lay at her feet. She reached down to touch them one last time, and then she was gone. Charlotte wrote to a friend that night. Her letter was brief and stark. Emily was dead. She had suffered terribly. She had refused all comfort to the end. Charlotte's grief was beyond words. The funeral was held 3 days later. December 25th, 1848. Patrick performed the service again. Another daughter in the vault. Another coffin next to Maria, Elizabeth Branwell. Emily Brontë, who loved the moors more than anything, was buried beneath the stone floor of the church. She never saw the open sky again. Keeper Emily's dog, a fierce mastiff she had tamed with her bare hands, attended the funeral. Charlotte wrote later that he lay at Emily's bedroom door for weeks afterward, whimpering. He seemed to understand that his mistress was gone, that she would not come back. He grieved, as dogs grieve, silently, loyally, with a broken heart. The parsonage was so quiet after Emily died. She had been the one who kept the household running. She had done the cooking, the baking, the cleaning. She had been the centre of the house, even if she rarely spoke. Now there was just absence. An Emily-shaped hole in every room. Charlotte and Anne came home from the funeral and looked at each other. They were the only ones left. 2 sisters out of 6 children. And Anne was coughing. Anne had been coughing for weeks. She had hidden it as well as she could. But now, with Emily dead, there was no hiding it anymore. Charlotte heard the cough and felt her heart break. Not again. Please, not again. But it was the same cough, the same fever, the same slow wasting. Tuberculosis. Anne did not fight it the way Emily had. She was different from Emily in every way. Where Emily had been fierce and defiant, Anne was gentle and resigned. She knew she was dying, and she accepted it. But she was only 28 years old and she did not want to die yet. She saw a doctor. She took the medicines he prescribed. She rested. She tried to eat, even though she had no appetite. She did everything Charlotte asked of her. She wanted to live. She fought for life in her own quiet way. January passed. February. March. Anne grew weaker. Cough was constant. She could not sleep lying down anymore. She sat propped up in bed, struggling for breath. Charlotte sat with her through the long nights. They were alone now, the two of them. Branwell had died in September, Emily in December. It was now April, and Anne was dying. 6 months. 3 deaths in 6 months. Charlotte was 32 years old and felt ancient. She had watched her mother die, the 2 elder sisters, her brother, Emily, and now Anne. How much grief could one person bear? Anne knew she was dying. She could feel it. But she had one wish. She wanted to see the sea. She had only seen the ocean once as a governess years ago. She had loved it. The vastness of it. The clean salt air. The sound of the waves. She wanted to see it one more time before she died. Charlotte thought this was madness. Anne was far too ill to travel. The journey would kill her. She should stay home, stay in bed, conserve her strength. But Anne was gentle, not weak. She insisted. She would go to the sea. She would breathe the sea air. She would die by the ocean if necessary. But she would not die in the parsonage. Not in that cold, dark house where everyone died. Not in Holworth. Charlotte gave in. She arranged for them to go to Scarborough, a seaside town on the east coast. Anne's former employer, the Robinson family, had a house there. It was May now. The sea air might help. Charlotte did not believe it. But she would give Anne this one thing. They left Haworth on 24th of May 1849. Anne, Charlotte and their friend Ellen Nussey, who came along to help. Time? Sir, the journey was difficult. Anne had to stop frequently to rest. She could barely walk. Charlotte and Ellen supported her between them. But Anne was determined. She wanted to see the sea. They arrived in Scarborough on 25th of May. Anne was exhausted, feverish, barely conscious. But the next morning Charlotte took her to the window. And there it was. The sea. Anne looked at it for a long time. The light on the water. The gulls. The sound of the waves. She smiled. She died 2 days later. On 28th of May 1849. 3 days after arriving in Scarborough. Charlotte was with her. So was Ellen Nussey. Anne's last moments were peaceful, unlike Emily's fierce struggle. She asked to be moved to a chair by the window so she could see the sea one last time. She said a prayer. She thanked Charlotte for bringing her. And then she closed her eyes. Anne Brontë was 29 years old. She had published 2 novels. She had seen the ocean. She was ready. Charlotte wrote to her father that night. The letter was brief and stark. Anne was dead. She had died peacefully. Charlotte could not come home yet. She needed time. She stayed in Scarborough for a few more days, walking on the beach, staring at the sea. Trying to understand how she was supposed to go on. Charlotte arranged for Anne to be buried in Scarborough. She could not bear the thought of bringing another coffin back to Holworth. Could not bear another funeral in that church. Anne would stay here, by the sea she loved. So Anne Brontë is the only one of the Brontë children not buried in the family vault. She lies in St Mary's churchyard in Scarborough, overlooking the ocean. Alone. Charlotte came home to Holworth on 1st June 1849. She came home alone. The parsonage was silent. Her father was there, of course. 72 years old now. He had buried his wife and 5 children. Only Charlotte remained. She walked through the empty house. The dining room where they had all written their novels together, walking in circles around the table. The stairs where Emily had struggled up and down, refusing help. Branwell's room. Anne's room. All empty now. Charlotte was 33 years old. She was the last of her generation. The sole survivor. And she was utterly, completely alone. How do you go on when everyone you love is dead? Charlotte Brontë did not know. In the months after Anne's death, she barely functioned. She moved through the parsonage like a ghost. She could not write. She could not read. She could barely speak. Her father worried about her. Patrick Brontë, who had always been so distant, tried to comfort his last remaining child. But what comfort could he offer? He had lost 5 children. He understood grief. But understanding did not make it easier to bear. Charlotte's publisher wrote to her. Her friends wrote to her. They urged her to work. To write. Work, they said, would save her. It would give her something to live for. Charlotte did not want to be saved. She wanted her sisters back. She wanted to sit at the dining room table with Emily and Anne walking in circles, discussing their stories. She wanted to hear Emily's fierce opinions about plot structure, Anne's gentle suggestions about character. She wanted the life she had lost. But that life was gone. And slowly, painfully, Charlotte began to accept it. She had been working on a novel before the death began. Shirley. She'd started it when everyone was still alive, when there had been hope. Now she picked it up again. Writing Shirley nearly destroyed her. Every page was agony. She had based one of the characters on Emily. Shirley Keeldar, strong, independent, uncompromising. Emily in fiction. Writing her felt like bringing Emily back to life, and then having to let her go again every time she set down the pen. But Charlotte finished it. Shirley was published in October 1849, a year after Emily's death. The critics were lukewarm. It was not as passionate as Jane Eyre, not as immediate. But it sold well. Charlotte Brontë was an established novelist now. Currer Bell was famous. By this time, the secret of the Bell pseudonyms was out. Charlotte had been forced to reveal herself to her publisher in 1848, and word had gradually spread. People knew now that Currer Bell was Charlotte Brontë, that Ellis and Acton Bell had been her sisters, that all 3 were now dead except Charlotte. The revelation caused a sensation. 3 sisters from a remote Yorkshire parsonage had written Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And 2 of them were already dead. It was romantic. Tragic. The public was fascinated. Charlotte hated the attention. She was shy, private, uncomfortable with fame. But she was also lonely. So when her publisher invited her to London, she went. The literary world embraced her. She met William Makepeace Thackeray, whom she admired enormously. She met Elizabeth Gaskell, who would become a friend and eventually her biographer. She went to dinner parties, galleries, the opera. She was treated as a literary celebrity. The meeting with Thackeray was particularly memorable. Charlotte had dedicated the 2nd edition of Jane Eyre to him. She considered him the greatest living novelist. When they finally met, Thackeray was charmed but somewhat overwhelmed. Charlotte was intense, serious, unwilling to engage in small talk. She wanted to discuss literature, truth, morality. Thackeray wanted to be witty and amusing. They talked past each other. Thackeray later wrote that Charlotte gave me the impression of being a very little and a very fierce woman. This was accurate. Charlotte was small and fierce, She had survived the death of almost everyone she loved. She had no patience for triviality. And she was miserable. Charlotte was small, plain, poorly dressed. She had a strong Irish accent from her father. She was painfully shy in company. She didn't know how to make small talk. At parties she sat silently in corners, overwhelmed and anxious. People stared at her. They whispered, "Is that really Currer Bell? She's so small. Time for ones and so plain." Charlotte went back to Holworth as soon as she could. London was exciting, but it was not home. Home was the parsonage, the moors, the quiet, the ghosts. Elizabeth Gaskell became a genuine friend. The two women corresponded frequently, and Gaskell visited Haworth several times. She was shocked by what she found there. The isolation, the coldness, the graves visible from every window. How had Charlotte survived this place? How had genius flourished in such barren soil? After Charlotte's death, Gaskell would write her biography. The Life of Charlotte Brontë, published in 1857, became one of the most influential literary biographies ever written. It shaped how generations would understand the Brontes. It created the myth of the tragic sisters on the moors. Some of it was accurate. Some of it was romanticised. All of it was written with genuine love for a woman who had died too young. She began work on another novel, Villette. Based on her experiences in Brussels, her unrequited love for Constantin Eyre. It was the most psychologically complex thing she'd written. Dark, introspective, full of loneliness and longing. The heroine, Lucy Snow, was Charlotte herself. Isolated. Watching life happen to other people. Never quite belonging. Villette was published in January 1853. It was acclaimed as a masterpiece. Charlotte's reputation was secure. She was one of the great novelists of her generation. But she was still alone. Charlotte had never expected to marry. She was plain, poor, no longer young. She was famous now, yes. But fame did not make her beautiful. It did not erase her poverty or her shyness. She had resigned herself to spinsterhood, to living with her aging father until he died, to being alone. And then Arthur Bell Nicholls proposed. Nicholls was her father's curate. He had been at Haworth for years. A quiet, serious man. Earnest, devout, utterly conventional. He had loved Charlotte for a long time. Silently. Hopelessly, he thought. He proposed in December 1852. Charlotte was stunned. She'd never thought of Nicholls that way. He was just there. Part of the furniture of her life. She said no. Patrick Brontë was furious that Nicholls had even asked. His curate marry his daughter? His famous daughter, the celebrated novelist? It was presumptuous. Insulting. Patrick forbade Charlotte from even speaking to Nicholls. Nicholls, heartbroken, left Haworth. He took a position in another parish. Charlotte thought that was the end of it. But Nicholls continued to write to her. And slowly Charlotte's feelings began to change. He was steady. Kind. He genuinely cared for her. Not for Currer Bell, the famous author. For Charlotte. The small, plain woman who had lost everyone she loved. She began to think that perhaps she could marry him. Perhaps she did not have to be alone. It took more than a year to convince her father. Patrick railed against the match. He would lose his curate and his daughter. He would be left alone. But eventually he gave in. Charlotte would marry Nichols. Nichols would return to Holworth as curate. They would all live together in the parsonage. Charlotte Brontë married Arthur Bell Nichols on 29th June 1854. She was 38 years old. The marriage was, by all accounts, happy. Not passionate. Not the wild romance of her novels. But comfortable. Companionable. Nichols was devoted to her. He protected her from intrusions. He encouraged her writing. He made her feel safe. Charlotte began to hope that she might have a future after all. That there might be life after so much death. And then, in early 1855, she became pregnant. Charlotte was 38, which was considered old for a first pregnancy even by Victorian standards. She was also small and frail. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. She suffered from terrible nausea. Hyperemesis gravidarum, we would call it now. Constant severe vomiting. She could not eat. She could not keep down water. She grew weaker and weaker. By March, she was bedridden. Doctors were called. They prescribed various treatments, none of which helped. Charlotte was wasting away. She also had a cough. Whether it was tuberculosis or simply the weakness brought on by starvation, we will never know for certain. But Charlotte was dying. She knew it. Nichols knew it. Her father knew it. Charlotte died on 30th March 1855. She was 38 years old. She had been married for 9 months. Her last words, whispered to her husband, were, "Oh, I am not going to die, am I? He will not separate us. We have been so happy." But she did die. In the parsonage where she was born. In the bed where she had slept all her life. The last of the Brontë children. The death certificate listed the cause as phthisis, tuberculosis. Modern scholars have debated this. Some believe Charlotte died of severe dehydration from the pregnancy-related vomiting. Others suggest typhus or another infection. Perhaps it was a combination. Perhaps the tuberculosis bacteria, dormant in her body for decades, reactivated when her immune system was compromised by the pregnancy. We will never know for certain. What we know is that Charlotte Brontë, who had watched her mother, her sisters, her brother all die in this house, died in it too. The parsonage that had been the cradle of so much genius became, finally, its grave. Patrick Brontë buried his last child on 4th April 1858. Another service in the church. Another coffin in the family vault. Charlotte joined her mother Maria Elizabeth Branwell and Emily beneath the stone floor. Only Anne was missing. Anne, far away in Scarborough, alone by the sea. Patrick was 78 years old. He had outlived his wife and all 6 of his children. He would live another 6 years. Alone in the parsonage except for his son-in-law Nichols, who stayed with him out of duty. Patrick went blind, He grew frail, but he did not die. He lived in a house full of ghosts. The dining room where his daughters had written their masterpieces. The stairs where Emily had dragged herself up and down. The bedroom where Charlotte had died. He heard their voices in every room. Saw their shadows on the walls. Patrick Brontë died on 7th of June 1861. He was 84 years old. He had lived in Holworth for 41 years. He'd come there with a wife and 6 children. He left it alone. After his death, Arthur Bell Nicholls returned to Ireland. He took with him the Brontë memorabilia, letters, manuscripts, personal effects. He remarried eventually. He lived to be 88. He rarely spoke of Charlotte in his later years. Some griefs are too deep for words. The parsonage passed to a new incumbent. For decades it was simply a working vicarage, home to successive clergy and their families. But pilgrims came. Readers who had been moved by Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. They wanted to see where the Brontes had lived, to walk the moors they had walked, to touch the stones they had touched. In 1928, the parsonage was purchased by the Brontë Society and turned into a museum. Today, it is one of the most visited literary sites in Britain. Hundreds of thousands of people come each year to stand in the dining room where the novels were written. To see Charlotte's wedding bonnet, Emily's writing desk, the tiny books they made as children. To pay homage to a family consumed by tuberculosis but immortalised by genius. The story of the Brontë family and tuberculosis is not just about death. It is about what people create in the face of death. All 3 sisters knew they were dying. They had seen it happen to Maria and Elizabeth, to Branwell, to each other. They knew the signs. Cough, the fever, the slow wasting. They knew there was no cure. That once the disease took hold, death was certain. And still they wrote. Emily wrote Wuthering Heights knowing she might not live to see it published. Anne wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall while caring for her dying brother and sister. Charlotte wrote Shirley in the months after watching Emily and Anne die. They wrote because they had to. Because the stories were in them and had to come out. Because writing was what they were born to do. Tuberculosis shaped their literature in profound ways. Illness and death are everywhere in their novels. Helen Burns dying of consumption in Jane Eyre. Catherine Earnshaw wasting away in Wuthering Heights. The sick children, the dying mothers, the characters who fade and vanish. Death is never far from the surface of these books. But there is also fierce life, passion, defiance, refusal to submit. Jane Eyre demanding equality and respect. Catherine Earnshaw declaring that she is Heathcliff. Helen Huntingdon leaving her husband to protect her son. These are not quiet, resigned heroines. They are fierce, angry, alive. The Brontes wrote as if their lives depended on it. Because in a sense they did. Writing was how they made sense of the world. How they processed grief. How they fought back against death. The tuberculosis bacteria might be destroying their bodies, but their minds were free. Their imaginations were infinite. No disease could touch that. And in the end, the books outlasted the disease. The bacteria that killed the Brontes are long gone. But Jane Eyre is still read. Wuthering Heights is still taught in schools. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is still in print. The sisters created something that death could not destroy. This is, perhaps, the only victory over tuberculosis that was possible in the 19th century. Not a medical victory, not survival, but a kind of immortality. The Bronte sisters died young, but their work lives on. And as long as people read their books, they are not really gone. Let us pause now and consider what we have witnessed tonight. We have followed a family through 40 years of loss. From the mother's death in 1821 to the father's death in 1861. We have watched 6 children grow up in a cold parsonage on the edge of the moors. We have seen 2 of them die as children, taken by the disease they caught at a charity school. We have seen the survivors create imaginary worlds together, their only escape from isolation and grief. We have watched them try to make their way in the world. As governesses, as teachers, as students in Brussels. We have watched them fail and fail again. And then we have watched them succeed, spectacularly and possibly, as novelists. 3 sisters, writing together at the dining room table, producing masterpieces that would outlast them by centuries. And we have watched them die. One by one. Branwell first, destroyed by addiction and despair. Then Emily, fierce to the end, refusing all comfort. Then Anne, gentle Anne, who only wanted to see the sea one last time. And finally Charlotte, who survived the longest and grieved the hardest. Who found love at the end, only to have it taken from her. The Bronte family has become, in our cultural imagination, the quintessential consumptive literary family. When we think of tuberculosis and genius, we think of them. The remote parsonage on the moors, the brilliant doomed children, the books written in the shadow of death. It has become a kind of myth. Like all myths, it contains truth and distortion in equal measure. The truth is that the Bronte children did die young. That tuberculosis devastated their family in a way that is almost unimaginable today. That they lived with the constant presence of death and still created extraordinary art. This is real. This happened. But the myth obscures as much as it reveals. It makes the Brontes seem passive, victims of fate, beautiful martyrs to disease and genius. And they were not that. They were fighters. Emily fighting until her body literally gave out beneath her. Anne fighting for the chance to see the sea one last time. Charlotte fighting to finish her novels even as grief threatened to overwhelm her. These were not passive, ethereal creatures. They were tough, practical, determined women. They had to be. Survival in 19th century Yorkshire required it. Consider what it meant to be a woman writer in the 1840s. There were successful female novelists, certainly. But they were often looked down upon. Women cannot write, the critics said. Their minds were too small. Their emotions too weak. They could manage sentimental romances, perhaps. But real literature? That was for men. The Brontes proved them wrong. Jane Eyre was more psychologically complex than most novels by men. Wuthering Heights was more daring. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was more morally courageous. These were not women's novels in the diminishing sense the critics meant. They were simply great novels. And they were written by women who had been told they could not write. The myth also suggests that their genius was somehow a product of their illness. That tuberculosis made them creative. That suffering was necessary for art. This is nonsense, of course. Dangerous, romantic nonsense. The Brontes were geniuses despite tuberculosis, not because of it. Imagine what they might have written if they had lived. If Charlotte had survived to 60, if Emily had had 20 more years, if Anne had been able to write more than 2 novels. We lost whole libraries when they died. Tuberculosis did not create their genius. It destroyed it before its time. And yet, there is something about the Bronte story that continues to haunt us. Something that speaks to our deepest fears and desires. We're afraid of death. All of us. Always. And we want to believe that death can be defeated. Not literally. We know we all die eventually. But symbolically. We want to believe that what we create can outlast us. That we can leave something behind. That our lives will have meant something. The Brontes did that. They died. All of them. Young and in pain and too soon. But their books remain. And in those books, they are still alive. Still fierce. Still brilliant. Still themselves. This is why we make pilgrimages to Haworth. Why thousands of people every year visit the parsonage, walk the moors, stand at the graves. We are not just paying tribute to dead writers. We are participating in their victory over death. We are proof that they succeeded, that they made something that lasts. The parsonage is a museum now. You can walk through the rooms where the Brontes lived, the dining room where they wrote, Charlotte's tiny dresses and glass cases, the miniature books on display. It is carefully preserved, meticulously maintained. A shrine to literary genius. But if you go early in the morning before the tourists arrive, you can almost feel them there. The ghost of the family. Charlotte walking in circles around the dining room table. Emily coming in from the moors, windblown and silent. Anne sitting in the corner with her sewing, thinking about Gondel. Branwell upstairs, young and hopeful still. The 2 eldest girls, Maria and Elizabeth, just shadows now. Barely remembered except in Charlotte's writing. The church is still there, of course. St. Michael and All Angels, where Patrick preached for 41 years. Where he buried his entire family. The family vault is beneath the floor, near the altar. A simple brass plaque marks the spot. Maria Branwell Bronte and her 5 children. Not Anne. Anne is still in Scarborough, by the sea. The graveyard is full. Crowded with Victorian tombstones, many of them for young people. Tuberculosis victims, most of them. Haworth was a place where people died young. The Brontes were not exceptional in that. They were only exceptional in what they left behind. If you walk out behind the parsonage, you can take the path to the moors. The Brontes walk this path every day. it is not much changed. The same hills, the same stone walls, the same wind. In summer, the heather blooms purple. In winter, the landscape is brown and bare and beautiful in its bleakness. You can walk for miles and see no one. Just the sky and the moor and the wind. This is what Emily loved. This wild, empty space. She put it in Wuthering Heights, not as setting, but as character. The moors in that novel are alive, indifferent, eternal. They were there before the Brontes. They are there still. They will be there when we are all gone. There is something comforting in that. The idea that some things endure. The moors, the books, the stories we tell about the people who wrote them. Tuberculosis could destroy the body. It could end a life. But it could not destroy the imagination. It could not silence the voice. It could not erase what had been written. We live in a time when tuberculosis is curable. When antibiotics can stop the disease in its tracks. When people who contract TB can expect to survive. This is an extraordinary gift of modern medicine. We should never take it for granted. The antibiotics that cure tuberculosis were not developed until the 1940s. If they had existed in the 1840s, the Brontes might have lived. Maria and Elizabeth might have survived Cowan Bridge. Branwell might have recovered from his illness. Emily, diagnosed early, might have been cured. Anne might have seen many more summers by the sea. Charlotte might have raised the child she was carrying when she died. A century separated the Brontes from a cure. 100 years. So close, and yet impossibly far. They lived and died in the gap between the disease and its remedy. Millions did. The tuberculosis epidemic of the 19th century was a tragedy on an unimaginable scale. The Brontes are famous, but they were not unique. They were just 6 people among the tens of millions who died. But we have lost something too. Or perhaps not lost, but forgotten. The Victorians lived with death in a way we do not. It was immediate, constant, unavoidable. Everyone knew someone who had died of tuberculosis. Every family had buried children. Death was not abstract. It was not something that happened to other people in hospitals, out of sight. It happened at home, in the bedroom, in the family. This intimacy with death shaped how people lived. It made them conscious of time in a way we are not. They knew that life was short, that opportunities might not come again, that there was no time to waste. The Brontes knew this. They had seen their sisters die young. They knew their own lives might be short. And so they wrote. Not someday. Not when they had more time or more money or more encouragement. But now, immediately, urgently, as if their lives depended on it. And perhaps they did. Perhaps writing was what kept them alive as long as they lived. The thing that gave their lives meaning and purpose. The thing that made the suffering bearable. Charlotte wrote about this in Villette. Lucy Snow, the narrator, speaks of the creative impulse as a kind of possession. Something that seizes you and will not let go. Something you have to express or die. This was Charlotte's own experience. She wrote because she had to, because not writing would have been a kind of death in itself. Emily seems to have felt the same way. We have so little of her personal writing, no letters, no diary except brief fragments. She was intensely private, but her poetry reveals a fierce inner life, a mystical sense of connection to something larger than herself. The moors, nature, the infinite. She wrote to capture that feeling, to make it permanent, to hold on to something that was always slipping away. Anne wrote with a different purpose. Moral purpose. She wanted to tell the truth about things people did not talk about. Alcoholism, domestic abuse, the exploitation of governesses. She wrote to expose injustice, to make people see, to change things. 3 sisters, 3 different motivations, but all of them writing with the same urgency. The same sense that this work mattered, that it had to be done, that there might not be time to do it later. They were right about that. There was not time. Emily died at 30, having published 1 novel. Anne died at 29, having published 2. Charlotte lived the longest, 38, and published 4 novels. 4. In a writing life of about 10 years. What would they have written if they had lived? If Emily had survived to Charlotte's age or beyond? If Anne had been able to develop her talent over decades instead of years? If Charlotte had lived to be an old woman, writing into her 60s and 70s? Consider what Charlotte accomplished in just 10 years of serious writing. Jane Eyre, Shirley, Villette, The Professor. 4 novels plus a fragment of a 5th. If she had lived another 30 years, she might have written 20 novels. She might have become one of the greatest novelists in English history, rather than merely one of the greatest. And Emily. Emily, who wrote 1 novel and a handful of poems that changed literature forever. What would a second Wuthering Heights have looked like? A third? Where would her mystical vision have taken her if she had lived another decade? We can only imagine. The disease that killed her killed possibilities as well as flesh. Anne too deserves more than she has received from history. She is often overlooked, the quiet sister, the youngest. But the Tenant of Wildfell Hall was revolutionary. It dealt with subjects, alcoholism, domestic abuse, a woman's right to leave a bad marriage, that Victorian society preferred to ignore. Anne was braver than her sisters in some ways. More willing to confront uncomfortable truths. If she had lived, she might have become a voice for the voiceless, a champion of those who suffered in silence. We will never know. Tuberculosis took that future from them. From us. But what they did leave us is extraordinary. 3 of the most important novels in English literature. Jane Eyre, which revolutionised the way novels portrayed women's inner lives. Wuthering Heights, which pushed the boundaries of what a novel could be. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which dared to address subjects no one else would touch. These books changed literature. They changed how we think about women, about passion, about morality, about the self. and they did it all in the shadow of death. Knowing that time was short, that the cough they heard in the next room might soon be their own, that the disease was in their blood, in their lungs, waiting. This is what makes the Bronte story so powerful. Not the death itself. Death comes to everyone eventually. But what they did in the face of death. They did not give up. They did not surrender to despair. They did not decide that since life was short, nothing mattered. Instead, they decided that since life was short, everything mattered. Every word, every page, every story. They wrote as if their lives depended on it. And in a very real sense they did. Not their physical lives. Tuberculosis was going to take those regardless. But their legacy, their meaning, their immortality. There is a photograph of the Bronte sisters. Or rather, there is a painting made by Branwell that is often reproduced. It shows 3 young women, Charlotte, Emily, Anne. They are dressed plainly, sitting close together. Their faces are serious, intelligent, watchful. Originally, Branwell had painted himself in the centre, but he was unsatisfied with the result, so he painted himself out. Now there is just a ghostly pillar where his figure used to be. The 3 sisters grouped around an absence. It is an eerily prophetic image. Branwell, who was supposed to be the genius of the family, reduced to a ghost. The sisters, who were supposed to be secondary, taking centre stage. And all of them gone now. All of them dead before their time. But the painting remains, and the books remain, and the story remains. We tell this story because it matters. Not as a romantic tragedy, not as a cautionary tale, but as evidence. Evidence that even in the face of death, even when everything is taken from you, you can create something that lasts. Something that matters. Something that death cannot touch. Every year, scholars discover new connections between the Brontes and their work. New ways that their lives shaped their art. The pain of Cowan Bridge became Lowood School. The loneliness of Brussels became Villette. The wild freedom of the moors became Wuthering Heights. Their lives were short, but they lived every moment with an intensity that most people never achieve. And that intensity pours off every page they wrote. The Bronte sisters were not special because they died young. They were special because they lived fully. Because they took their small lives in a remote parsonage and made them infinite. Because they turned their pain and isolation and grief into art. Because they refused to be silenced. Tuberculosis killed them. But it did not defeat them. If you go to Haworth today, you can stand in the parsonage, dining room, the room where the Bronte sisters walked in circles discussing their novels. The table is still there, the chairs, the window overlooking the graveyard. It is a small room, plain, cold, even in summer. Nothing about it suggests genius or immortality. It is just a room in a house in a small Yorkshire village. And yet, in this room, Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre. Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights. Anne Bronte wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. In this small, cold room, 3 women created works of art that would outlast them by centuries. That would change literature. That would change the world in small but permanent ways. They knew they were dying. All of them. They had seen it happen to their sister, to their brother. They knew the signs. They knew there was no cure. And still they wrote. Not someday. Not when things were easier. But now, today, in this moment. This is what we can learn from them. Not that suffering creates art. It does not. Not that death is romantic. It is not. But that time is precious. That we do not know how much of it we have. That if there is something we need to say, something we need to create, something that matters to us, we should do it now. Not when we have more time, more resources, more courage, but now. While we can. The Bronte sisters died. Tuberculosis took them one by one until the parsonage was silent. But their books endure. And in those books they are still alive. Still fierce. Still brilliant. Still themselves. Death is not the end. Not when you leave something behind. Not when your words still speak to people 200 years later. Not when your story still matters. If you visit Anne's grave in Scarborough today, you will find it marked by a simple headstone. The original inscription contained an error. It listed her age as 28 instead of 29. Charlotte, in her grief, had made a mistake. She could not bring herself to return to correct it. The Bronte Society eventually added a new memorial, but the original stone still stands. A testament to grief. To human error in the face of a loss. To the impossibility of getting everything right when your heart is breaking. Tonight, we have spent time with the Bronte family. With Maria and Elizabeth, who died as children. With Branwell, who wasted his gifts. With Emily, who refused to surrender even at the end. With Anne, who wanted only to see the sea one last time. With Charlotte, who survived the longest and mourned the hardest. And with Patrick, who buried them all. Their story is sad. Of course it is. How could it be anything else? 6 children, 5 dead before the age of 40. A father left alone. So much talent, so much life cut short. But it is also a story of triumph. Of creativity in the face of death. Of meaning snatched from meaninglessness. Of 3 women who took their small constrained lives and made them infinite. We remember them. We read their books. We visit their home. We tell their story. And in doing so, we participate in their victory. We prove that they were right. That the work mattered. That they mattered. That they still matter all these years later. If you have found this episode meaningful, please consider sharing it. The stories we tell about tuberculosis are important. They help us understand our past. They help us appreciate what we have now. They remind us that we're not the first people to face death, and we will not be the last. But we can face it with courage, with creativity, with the determination to leave something behind that matters. The Brontes faced their deaths as they had faced their lives, together, supporting each other, creating beauty even in the darkest moments. Emily died with her dogs at her feet and her family around her. Anne died looking at the sea she had travelled so far to see. Charlotte died in the arms of a husband who truly loved her. They were not alone. In the end, that may be what matters most. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening to these stories. There are more to come, more episodes, more histories, more forgotten voices. I hope you will join me for them. For now, rest well. Think of the Brontes walking the moors. Think of them gathered around the dining room table, writing by candlelight. Think of them young and alive and full of stories. Think of them not as victims, but as victors. People who lived fully, loved deeply, and created work that death could not destroy. The wind still blows across the Yorkshire moors. The heather still blooms purple in the summer. The parsonage still stands at the top of the village, looking out over the graveyard where 5 of the Brontë children lie. The church bells still toll, as they tolled for Maria and Elizabeth, for Branwell and Emily and Charlotte. But the stories live on. Jane Eyre still demands to be treated as an equal. Heathcliff still haunts the moors, searching for Catherine. Helen Burns still faces death with impossible courage. And somewhere right now, someone is opening one of these books for the first time. Falling into the world the Brontes created. Being changed by it, as millions have been changed before. This is the only immortality we can hope for. Not the preservation of our bodies, which will all fail eventually, but the preservation of our words, our stories, our truths. The Bronte sisters are gone, but they're also still here, still speaking to us across nearly 2 centuries, still alive in the only way that matters. Good night,